Imagine you survived the French Revolution only to find out life under the new government is worse than under the old one. Such was the case for many Parisians in the 1790s. The streets of Paris were dangerous, dirty, and deadly. Food was scarce, the economy was in sharp decline, and the guillotine was always around the corner. Let's find out more about why daily life in 1790s Paris was terrifying. We depend on advertising revenue to make our videos. So please consider supporting us by supporting us, starving to death. The French Revolution ended in 1794 with Robespierre's fall from power and the end of the Reign of Terror, but peace and quiet did not follow. In fact, the people of Paris endured another decade of chaos, instability, and starvation. The revolution had devastated the French economy. Trade was disrupted, manufacturing slowed down, and prices skyrocketed. While the privileged classes lost their status and power, they also lost their wealth. As a result, many former aristocrats were forced to flee France or live in exile. This mass exodus led to a labor shortage, especially in the agricultural sector. Crops were left unplanted and livestock were left without caretakers. Consequently, food production plummeted. In 1795, the Convention National, which was still running France at the time, started rationing wheat flour and bread to its citizens. Each Parisian was allowed to buy a maximum of 2 pounds of flour or half a pound of bread every 2 days. Even so, supplies dwindled further, and the quality of the loaves got worse and worse. By 1796, the government was spending 25 times more on grain than it had in 1789, and yet it couldn't keep up with demand. People began starving. In August of that year, a group of women marched on the city hall to demand more bread. Soon, similar revolts erupted across France. They were put down violently, but they highlighted just how dire the situation had become. By 1797, the annual death toll in Paris from starvation and hunger-related diseases reached over 30,000 people. When the situation became too dire, the government responded with more rationing. By 1798, each person was only allowed to purchase 1 pound of flour or 1/4 of a pound of bread every 8 days. Can you imagine waiting 8 whole days for such a meager portion? People were reduced to eating dogs and cats. Meat prices were through the roof, so Parisians killed off their pets and sent them to market. If you couldn't afford meat, you could pick up a cat or dog for dinner. But be careful when you do though, because the same could happen to you. With no law protecting private property, people stole whatever they could get their hands on, including other people's pets. At this point, most animals on the streets belonged to the soup kitchens run by the National Health Committee. These establishments offered free meals to the destitute and the hungry. However, they were often overcrowded and the food was barely edible. To escape these insufferable conditions, some turned to petty crime. Shoplifting became widespread, but it was dangerous to steal. After all, there were laws against it, and if caught, you would face severe punishment. The guillotine. As we mentioned earlier, the French Revolution brought about significant political and social changes. It overthrew the monarchy and established a republic. However, this period of transformation was marked by intense turmoil and violence, culminating in what is now known as the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror began in 1793 and lasted until 1794. This tumultuous period witnessed the use of the guillotine, a device designed for swift and supposedly humane execution, primarily as a means to eliminate those deemed enemies of the revolution. During this era, suspicion and fear permeated society. Thousands upon thousands of French citizens faced accusations of disloyalty or opposition to the revolution, often based on flimsy evidence or mere association with disfavored individuals or groups. Prominent figures like King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, along with members of the clergy and nobility, were among the early victims of the guillotine. As the revolutionary fervor intensified, the guillotine became a symbol of the radicalism and upheaval of the time. Its shadow loomed large, casting an air of uncertainty and peril over everyday life in Paris during the late 18th century. The constant threat of sudden and violent demise pervaded the streets. Citizens navigated a landscape where loyalty and disloyalty were fluid, where whispers could betray and where survival often hinged on the fickle winds of public opinion and the capricious nature of the revolutionary tribunals. In fact, during this time, anyone could be arrested at any given moment for disobeying the revolution or plotting against the republic. A citizen might come home from work only to find their house surrounded by armed revolutionaries. They would drag the person out of their home and take them away to prison. There they would await trial before the revolutionary tribunal. This court was not bound by rules of evidence or procedure. Trials were swift affairs lasting no more than a few minutes. The accused was found guilty almost immediately after the trial began. The judges and jury had already made up their minds. The finality of this process was inescapable. Once the verdict was delivered, the condemned were led to the guillotine, their fates sealed in an instant. The blade fell, ending their lives abruptly and sending their heads rolling into the waiting crowd. But the Reign of Terror ended and the guillotine fell silent. Right? Wrong. Even after Robespierre's downfall, the guillotine continued to operate. The Thermidorian reaction, which ended the Reign of Terror, ushered in a more moderate government. However, it didn't bring stability to France. On the contrary, the next years were turbulent and saw the rise of various political factions, each vying for power and influence. These factions, with their competing agendas and ideologies, plunged Paris into a state of constant turmoil. Royalists, Jacobins, the streets became battlegrounds where rival factions clashed violently, turning everyday life into a gamble. For Paris, walking down a street might mean getting caught in a crossfire between royalist rebels and Republican loyalists. Bands of revolutionaries would break into houses to search for counter-revolutionaries and suspected enemies of the state. If they found anyone who displeased them, they dragged them outside and executed them in the street. The guillotine remained a constant and chilling fixture of urban life in Paris throughout the 1790s. Dangerous streets. Aside from factional fighting, Paris in the 1790s was plagued by common crimes as well. Robbery, rape, and murder were commonplace. Street lamps were few and far between, leaving the city in darkness. Most Parisians couldn't even read, meaning they couldn't tell one another in the dark. What little lighting there was expensive to use. Many people simply stayed indoors after sunset. However, others had no choice but to roam the streets at night, such as soldiers and police, who patrolled the streets in the dark to keep the peace and quell potential rebellions. They were frequently attacked and killed by roving bands of criminals. Bandits, thieves, and murderers roamed the streets, preying on the unsuspecting populace. Travel at night was a risky endeavor, and even during the day, open spaces were considered unsafe. The streets were poorly maintained and littered with trash, animal carcasses, and human eggs. Add to that the smoke from the numerous workshops and business. Maximilien Robespierre, the man who put the eye in your iPhone, is one of history's most notorious villains. No, wait, that's the guy who played Hannibal Lecter. But still, Robespierre's got to be up there with some of history's worst, right? Well, yes, he was responsible for hundreds of deaths, but in his own mind, he was just trying to build a better world. So let's take a quick break from judging 18th century French revolutionaries to talk about their hair. Here are the last days of As we may have mentioned before, there was a whole lot of killing going on in France at this time. The country was under siege, both internally and externally. And while the storming of the Bastille is often seen as a heroic moment, it is also important to remember that the king and his family were imprisoned in the palace next door to where those revolutionaries were partying. A certain queen was especially unhappy about this turn of events. Marie Antoinette had been looking forward to her evening constitutional along with the rose bushes outside the palace walls, but instead found herself stuck inside with the king and two kids, along with an armed mob that would occasionally storm the gates and demand the royal family's head. Of course, this situation could have been avoided if the king had just chopped down those pesky rose bushes and put in a moat or at least a couple of those iron things with the spikes. But King Louis XVI was no Darkford. In fact, when those rose bushes were planted by his father, Louis XIV, they were meant as a gift to the people of Paris, and cutting them down would have been seen as an act of aggression. Plus, what kind of king locks his wife and kids in a cage? Not a very nice one, that's for sure. But in fairness, Louis XVI was not exactly known for his leadership skills, and while he did have his wife and kids to think about, he also had to worry about the welfare of another subject, Maximilien Robespierre. You see, while Robespierre wasn't born into the French monarchy, he was pretty much born into the French Revolution. Born in 1758 in a small village in northern France, Robespierre came from a family of minor landowners and was able to afford a decent education. In fact, he was educated so well that he became a lawyer and spent his early career defending peasants who were being screwed by the French nobility. Naturally, this made him very popular with the Mossos, though it didn't do much for his bank account. To make ends meet, Robespierre took on another gig as a journalist and used his position to attack the French monarchy. One might even say that Robespierre, a man who wanted to help the downtrodden commoners and reform the corrupt government. That's kind of like me, except I don't write articles attacking the French monarchy. I make videos about them. Man, it's a tough gig. Anyway, when the revolution kicked off in 1789, Robespierre was right there helping draft the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And when the National Assembly needed someone to argue for the death penalty for those disgusting aristocrats who stormed the Champ de Mars in July, there was Robespierre again. He was even there in September when the French people decided that the best way to deal with counter-revolutionaries was to kill them. Literally, Robespierre argued against the massacres, believing that it would be more effective to imprison suspected enemies of the revolution and then execute them quietly. And while his colleagues didn't love his suggestions, they agreed to give it a try. After all, this was only the beginning of the revolution, and Robespierre was quickly rising through the ranks. In fact, he would soon become one of the most powerful men in France. But first, he needed a new wig. Now, if you're watching this channel, chances are you know all about the Terror, the period during which Robespierre and his fellow revolutionaries executed anyone who opposed them, including many of their former allies. But if you need a quick refresher, basically France was under attack and Robespierre wanted to stop anyone who might be helping the enemy, even if they weren't actually doing anything. And so he instituted a legal system that allowed for the arrest and execution of anyone who was suspected of counter-revolution. This led to hundreds of deaths and eventually the deaths of Robespierre himself. But at the time, It seemed like a great idea. In fact, it seemed like such a great idea that Robespierre went ahead and gave a speech about it. But unfortunately, some members of the National Convention didn't like the sound of this new legal system. They argued that it violated the rights of French citizens and was just an excuse to get rid of anyone who disagreed with the revolution. Robespierre naturally disagreed, and so the two sides debated the issue until Robespierre's friends started making accusations of their own. These men claimed that their opponents were counter-revolutionaries, and when the vote was over, they were proven right. Robespierre's opponents were arrested and sent to the guillotine. It was at this point that Marat declared, if only these damned Girondins could be exterminated like the vermin which they are, there would be less bloodshed. Robespierre even ordered the newspaper offices of those journalists who opposed him shut down, a move that led to accusations that he was becoming a dictator. But Robespierre brushed these concerns aside, saying, "Dictator, no. I am a public servant. The nation is in peril. I have but one aim, its salvation. Let the opposition come. We shall fear it only if we are not serving the state as well as our country demands." And so the killings continued. In January of 1794, the revolution was in full swing and Robespierre was at the height of his power. He had successfully purged the National Convention of his enemies and now controlled the Committee of Public Safety, which had the power to arrest and execute anyone who was suspected of counter-revolution. In other words, Robespierre was effectively running the country, and he was using that power to crush anyone who opposed him. However, this was not necessarily his goal when he entered politics. As we mentioned earlier, Robespierre was an idealist who wanted to reform the French government and help the common people. In fact, he wasn't even a big fan of violence. But as the revolution progressed, things changed. Robespierre became more and more convinced that the only way to achieve his goals was through terror. In his own words, terror is nothing but swift, severe and unrelenting justice. It is, then, in every sense, an emanation of the general will. So he embraced terror and used it to consolidate his power and crush his enemies. Unfortunately, this led to a lot of bloodshed, but Robespierre didn't seem to mind. But everything changed in July of 1794 when Robespierre's younger brother Augustin sent him a letter begging for his help. See, Augustin was in prison, and he thought that his brother could get him out. But Maximilien Robespierre didn't want to help his own brother. You see, Augustin had become a Girondin, and Maximilien was using his power to hunt them down. Even worse, when Augustin tried to explain that he was innocent, Robespierre didn't listen. Instead, he had him executed. This was a turning point for Robespierre. His friends and colleagues started to realize that he was capable of anything, and they began to distance themselves from him. And on July 27, 1794, the Committee of Public Safety arrested Robespierre. He was taken to the same place where he had sent so many of his enemies, the guillotine. And as the blade fell, one of his last sayings was, "O citizens, what a moment for my departure." And with that, Robespierre was dead, killed by the revolution he helped start. But hey, at least he died with a full head of hair. Paris is known for its incredible food, its revolutionary history in art, fashion, culture, and of course, wine. But there's another thing that Paris is also known for: salons. A salon is a traditional French gathering where people meet to discuss ideas in an informal setting, usually with wine. In ancient Greece, salons were philosophical schools, which is how we get the word salon from the Greek word for wisdoms. The goal was to bring together interesting people who could share ideas in an informal setting over good food and drink. This ancient tradition is still alive and well in Paris today. In this episode, we're going inside one of them to learn about wine and philosophy and even secret politics. Bonjour, mes amis. I'm here to introduce you to a place in Paris where intellectuals gather to discuss philosophy, politics, and other matters of importance while sipping fine wines. Welcome to the Salon. Our salon is located in the Latin Quarter near the Sorbonne, the famous university founded by a man who shared his name. Our host is someone who, like the ancient Greeks, believes in the power of bringing people together to share ideas and engage in thoughtful discussions. A retired philosophy professor at the Sorbonne, he has been hosting salons for over 30 years, bringing together people from all walks of life to talk about everything from politics to art to literature. As we enter his home, we are greeted by the warm glow of candlelight and the soft murmur of conversation. The apartment is filled with books and antiques, and we can't help but feel like we have just stepped into another time. As we make our way to the dining room, we pass by a table piled high with books, each one a potential topic for tonight's discussion. We choose a book at random and open it to reveal a quote from the ancient Greek philosopher Plato: "The unexamined life is not worth living." It's a fitting reminder that we are about to spend an evening with some of the greatest minds in Paris. We settle into our seats around the table and are served glasses of wine. The salon is about to begin. Our host welcomes us and introduces the other guests. There is a mix of locals and tourists, young and old, and we quickly forget that we are in a Parisian apartment and feel as though we have traveled back in time to ancient Greece. The conversation flows easily, bouncing from one topic to the next like the exchange of ideas in a game of verbal tennis. Our host, with his deep knowledge and infectious enthusiasm, keeps the ball in play, ensuring that everyone has a chance to share their thoughts. Tonight's discussion centers around the meaning of happiness and whether it can be found through pleasure or only through intellectual pursuits. One guest, a young woman studying literature at the Sorbonne, argues that true happiness can only be found through the pursuit of knowledge. Another, a retired businessman, counters that happiness can also be found in simpler pleasures in life, such as a glass of wine or a good meal. The debate rages on, with everyone chiming in with their thoughts, until finally our host brings us back to the original question: what is the meaning of happiness? As the discussion continues, we find ourselves agreeing and disagreeing, challenging and being challenged, but through it all, we feel energized and inspired by the passion and intelligence of those around us. One of the guests, a local artist, speaks up. "I believe that happiness is not a destination, but rather a journey," she says. "It's not something you find, but something you create." Her words hang in the air long after she has spoken, and we all take a moment to consider her perspective. Then, as if on cue, a bottle of wine is opened, and we raise our glasses to toast to the journey of happiness. And as the wine flows, so does the conversation, covering everything from art and literature to politics and current events. The group is lively and engaged, and we can't help but feel like we are part of something special. But it's not just the ideas that are on offer here. It's also about the community, the sense of belonging that comes from being part of a group of like-minded individuals who are passionate about learning and growing. We learn about the latest political scandal from a journalist who was there when it broke. We hear about the city's most exciting new art exhibit from the artist who is exhibiting there. We discuss the meaning of life itself with a retired philosophy professor who has devoted his life to answering just that question. And all the while the wine flows and the food is served. Each dish is a masterpiece, prepared with fresh, locally sourced ingredients and paired with the perfect wine. We savor the flavors, not just because they are delicious, but because they are a celebration of life itself. After all, as the ancient Greeks believed, food and wine are not just sustenance, they are a source of pleasure and a way to bring people together. As the evening draws to a close, we say our goodbyes and make plans to meet again soon. We leave the salon feeling inspired, energized, and grateful for the opportunity to have spent an evening with some of the brightest minds in Paris. We head out into the cool night air, the streets of Paris alive with the sounds of music and laughter. We can't help but feel like we are a part of something bigger than ourselves, the rich intellectual tradition of this city, the legacy of the salons that have been a part of Parisian life for centuries. As we make our way home, we can't stop thinking about the conversations we've had, the ideas we've exchanged, and the friendships we've made. We've learned something new, tasted some amazing food and wine, and most importantly, we've been reminded of the power of human connection. The salon may have ended, but the conversation continues in our minds, and we know that we will be back again soon, eager to join the circle once more and lose ourselves in the magic of the salon. Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you want to learn more about wine, be sure to check out our online wine courses. Until next time, cheers. Now let us take a look at some of the feedback we've received from viewers just like you. This video is fantastic. It is the best thing I have seen on YouTube so far. Congratulations and keep up the great work. Another viewer had this to say: "Your videos are always so interesting and informative. I love learning about different wines and regions. Keep up the great work." And finally, this viewer had this to say: "I am so glad I stumbled upon your channel. Your videos are the perfect way to relax and unwind after a long day. Cheers." We've poured our hearts and souls into this channel, and it is wonderful to hear that our hard work is paying off. We were so glad that you were along for the ride as we explore the world of wine together. So grab a glass of your favorite wine and join us as we continue our journey. Cheers.